The shadow of scarcity. Picture this: a laboratory in Mannheim, Germany, 1913. The air thick with coal dust and chemical vapors. A brilliant chemist named Friedrich Bergius stands before a towering steel apparatus, watching black coal transform into something that would reshape the world. Liquid gold flowing from stone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to understand how the absence of something so fundamental could drive a nation to extraordinary lengths. Germany has always been a land of contradictions, rich in coal, poor in oil, abundant in engineering minds, starved of natural resources. By the early 20th century, this imbalance had become more than an inconvenience. It had become an existential threat. The German Empire consumed oil like a growing organism consumes oxygen. Every battleship, every emerging automobile, every industrial process demanded more petroleum than the nation's meager domestic reserves could provide. Romania supplied some crude oil, but it was a trickle compared to the vast lakes of petroleum flowing from American wells or the promising fields being discovered across the Middle East. In the coal mines of the Ruhr Valley, thousands of workers descended each morning into a different kind of darkness. The rhythmic hammering of picks against coal faces echoed through tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the German countryside. Here was Germany's true wealth, millions of tons of carbonized forests laid down over geological ages. Coal powered the nation's steel mills, heated its homes, drove its industrial revolution. But coal, for all its abundance, had limitations. You couldn't pour coal into the fuel tank of a submarine. You couldn't refine coal into the lubricants that kept precision machinery running smoothly. The world was changing, and liquid fuels were becoming the lifeblood of modern warfare and commerce. This reality kept German strategic planners awake at night. They understood what the British Admiralty had grasped when they converted their fleet from coal to oil. Liquid fuels offered power, speed, and efficiency that solid fuels simply couldn't match. But Germany's geographic position meant they would always be dependent on imports. Vulnerable to naval blockades, subject to the whims of foreign suppliers. The Great War had demonstrated this vulnerability with brutal clarity. British naval supremacy had slowly strangled German supply lines. By 1917, German submarines were operating on severely rationed fuel allocations. The home front faced shortages that affected everything from transportation to heating. The lesson was unmistakable. In future conflicts, access to petroleum would determine victory or defeat. It was in this context of strategic vulnerability that two German chemists would propose what seemed impossible: creating oil from Germany's abundant coal reserves. Not just any oil, but high-quality synthetic fuels that could power the machines of a modern industrial state. Karl Bosch was already a legend in German chemical circles. Tall, methodical, with the bearing of a Prussian engineer, he had revolutionized ammonia production through the Haber-Bosch process. This breakthrough had allowed Germany to produce fertilizers and explosives domestically, reducing dependence on imported nitrates. Now, in the aftermath of defeat, Bosch turned his attention to an even greater challenge. Friedrich Bergius was cut from different cloth, younger, more experimental, willing to pursue ideas that others dismissed as impractical. His laboratory in Mannheim had become a playground for high-pressure chemistry, where coal was subjected to temperatures and pressures that mimicked geological processes. The science behind their work was elegant in its simplicity, complex in its execution. Coal, they understood, was simply petroleum that hadn't finished its natural transformation. Given enough heat, pressure, and time, organic matter becomes petroleum. The Earth's crust provided these conditions over millions of years. But what if human ingenuity could accelerate this process, compress geological time into industrial time? Bergius had already demonstrated the basic principle. In his steel reactors, coal could be broken down and rebuilt into liquid hydrocarbons. The process required enormous pressures, hundreds of atmospheres crushing the coal while hydrogen gas was forced into the molecular structure. Temperatures soared beyond what most industrial processes could sustain, but the result was undeniable. From coal emerged gasoline, diesel fuel, and lubricants virtually indistinguishable from petroleum products. The early experiments were crude affairs. Bergius would load small amounts of coal dust into thick-walled steel vessels, seal them with hydrogen gas, and subject the mixture to punishing conditions. The vessels themselves became works of engineering art, steel walls inches thick, designed to contain pressures that would have exploded conventional equipment. When the process worked, the transformation seemed almost magical. Black coal dust disappeared, replaced by clear liquids that burned with the clean flame of refined petroleum. The yield was low, the energy requirements enormous, but the principle was proven. Germany could manufacture its own oil. Karl Bosch saw immediately what this meant for German industrial strategy. His company, BASF, had the engineering expertise to scale laboratory processes into industrial production. They had experience with high-pressure chemistry, with complex catalyst systems, with the kind of precision manufacturing that synthetic fuel production would require. But Bosch also understood the economics. Synthetic fuel would never compete with natural petroleum on price. The energy required to transform coal into liquid fuel meant that synthetic gasoline would cost several times more than imported oil. Under normal market conditions, the technology would remain a laboratory curiosity. These were not normal conditions. Germany in the 1920s was a nation rebuilding, rearming, and reconsidering its place in the world. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed severe restrictions on German military capabilities, but it said nothing about industrial chemistry. A technology that could free Germany from petroleum imports was worth almost any price. The first commercial plants began taking shape in the mid-1920s. BASF constructed massive facilities where coal arrived by the trainload and emerged as refined fuels. The Leuna plant, sprawling across hundreds of acres, became a testament to German engineering ambition. Towers rose like steel cathedrals, connected by miles of piping that carried coal, hydrogen, and synthetic crude through the various stages of processing. Workers at these plants operated in a world of extremes: pressures that could crush steel, temperatures that glowed white-hot, chemical processes that demanded split-second timing and absolute precision. A single mistake could destroy equipment worth millions of marks, or cost lives. Yet the technology worked. Month by month, the synthetic fuel plants increased their output. German automobiles ran on gasoline derived from domestic coal. Lufthansa aircraft flew on synthetic aviation fuel. The dream of petroleum independence was becoming reality. But there was something darker taking shape alongside this technological triumph. The synthetic fuel program required enormous amounts of labor, not just skilled chemists and engineers, but thousands of workers to mine coal, transport materials, and operate the massive industrial complexes. As Germany's political climate shifted toward authoritarianism, the question of labor supply would take on sinister dimensions. The coal mines that fed the synthetic fuel plants operated on an ever-expanding scale. Deeper shafts, longer tunnels, more intensive extraction. The work was dangerous under the best circumstances. Coal dust that could explode without warning. Tunnel collapses that could trap miners for days. The slow poisoning of lungs that came from breathing coal particles year after year. German mining companies had traditionally relied on voluntary labor, supplemented by foreign workers who came seeking employment. But the synthetic fuel program's appetite for coal was insatiable. Meeting production targets would require labor on a scale that voluntary recruitment could not provide. As we drift deeper into this story, as we follow the transformation of laboratory curiosity into industrial necessity, we'll discover how technological triumph became intertwined with human tragedy, how the quest for petroleum independence led to choices that would haunt a generation. The coal continues to flow from the mines. The synthetic fuel plants hum with activity. But in the shadows, plans are taking shape that will transform voluntary workers into forced laborers, that will turn scientific achievement into an instrument of oppression. For now, though, let the rhythm of machinery lull you toward rest. Picture those early chemists working by lamplight in their laboratories, convinced they were solving their nation's greatest strategic challenge. They could not foresee where their discoveries would lead, could not imagine the moral compromises that lay ahead. The coal dust settles, the pressure vessels cool, and in the quiet between one breakthrough and the next, we prepare to explore how human ingenuity, unconstrained by moral boundaries, can create wonders and horrors in equal measure. The 4-year plan and the rise of Leuna. The year is 1936. Germany's economy pulses with an almost feverish energy, a nation rebuilding itself through sheer force of will and industrial ambition. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, stands before a gathering of industrialists and party officials in Berlin. His voice carries the weight of absolute authority as he unveils what will become known as the Four-Year Plan. Germany must be economically independent, he declares, his words echoing through the marble halls of power. We must produce what we need, when we need it, without reliance on foreign suppliers who might abandon us in our hour of greatest need. The plan is breathtaking in its scope and audacity. 4 years to transform Germany into a fortress of self-sufficiency. 4 years to build an industrial machine capable of supporting whatever ambitions the Reich might harbor. And at the heart of this transformation, synthetic fuel production. The numbers alone tell a story of unprecedented commitment. Over 1 billion Reichsmarks, a sum that staggers even seasoned industrialists, will be poured into expanding Germany's synthetic fuel capacity. New plants will rise from empty fields. Existing facilities will triple in size. The goal is nothing less than complete petroleum independence by 1940. In the industrial heartland of central Germany, the earth trembles with construction. Leuna, a small town in Saxony-Anhalt, becomes the epicenter of this chemical revolution. Here, the Leuna Werke, already one of Europe's largest chemical complexes, begins its transformation into something unprecedented in industrial history. The scale defies imagination. Picture, if you will, a city built not for people, but for chemistry itself. Cooling towers rise like concrete cathedrals against the German sky. Steam pipes snake between buildings in endless silver coils. The air shimmers with heat from 1,000 chemical processes running day and night without pause. Otto Ambros arrives at Leuna in the spring of 1937, a brilliant chemist with piercing eyes and an analytical mind that can dissect the most complex chemical processes. He has been chosen to oversee the expansion of synthetic fuel production. At 37 years old, Ambros represents the new generation of German industrial leadership, technically gifted, politically reliable, and utterly committed to the Reich's vision of autarky. Walking through the construction zones, Ambros surveys what will become his domain. Excavators tear into the Saxon earth, preparing foundations for reaction vessels that will dwarf anything previously built. Each hydrogenation unit, each catalytic chamber, each distillation tower represents months of careful engineering and millions of Reichsmarks in investment. The technical challenges are immense. Coal liquefaction requires temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius and pressures that could crush a man in an instant. The steel for the reaction vessels must be specially treated to withstand both the corrosive chemicals and the enormous mechanical stresses. German metallurgists work around the clock, developing new alloys that can endure conditions that would destroy conventional materials. But it is not merely a matter of building larger versions of existing equipment. The four-year plan demands innovation, breakthrough thinking that can multiply production while reducing costs. Ambros and his team of chemists work with an intensity born of national urgency. They modify catalysts, adjust reaction conditions, and redesign entire process flows in pursuit of ever greater efficiency. The Burgess process, once confined to laboratory glassware and small pilot plants, must be scaled up to industrial proportions. What worked with kilograms of coal must now work with thousands of tons. The chemistry remains the same. Hydrogen forced into coal under extreme conditions until the solid carbon transforms into liquid fuel. But the engineering challenges multiply exponentially. Consider the logistics alone. Each Leuna production unit consumes trainloads of coal every single day. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's coal heartland, sends an endless procession of freight cars eastward to feed the synthetic fuel plants. The railway infrastructure groans under this constant traffic. New rail lines are laid, existing tracks are reinforced, and switching yards expand to handle the unprecedented volume. Water, too, becomes a critical resource. The chemical processes require enormous quantities, not just for cooling, but as a source of hydrogen itself. The Saale River, which flows past Leuna, is diverted and channeled through the industrial complex. Massive pumping stations draw water from deep aquifers. Treatment plants purify the water to chemical standards far exceeding what humans would require for drinking. Inside the production halls, German engineering reaches new heights of sophistication. The reaction vessels, towering cylinders of specially treated steel, stand like monuments to industrial ambition. Each one represents months of fabrication by the finest metalworkers in the Reich. The tolerances are measured in fractions of millimeters. A single flaw in the steel could result in catastrophic failure under the enormous pressures required for coal liquefaction. The control systems fascinate visiting engineers from around the world. Banks of gauges monitor temperature, pressure, flow rates, and chemical composition at every stage of the process. German technicians, trained for months in the intricacies of synthetic fuel production, adjust valves and monitor reactions with the precision of master craftsmen. Yet beneath this technical excellence, darker currents begin to flow. The 4-year plan's ambitious timelines create pressures that test the limits of conventional labor practices. Construction crews work extended shifts. Factory workers face production quotas that seem to increase monthly. The demand for workers, skilled and unskilled alike, begins to outstrip Germany's domestic labor supply. Ambros, focused on his technical responsibilities, initially pays little attention to workforce issues. His concern lies with catalysts and reaction kinetics, not personnel management. But even he begins to notice changes in the composition of construction crews. Faces that look different, workers who speak German with unfamiliar accents, men who seem to work with a desperate intensity that goes beyond normal industrial motivation. The first synthetic gasoline flows from the expanded Leuna facility in late 1937. It is a moment of triumph for German chemistry. Clear, colorless liquid fuel created from nothing but coal, water, and human ingenuity. Goering himself visits the plant for a ceremonial inspection, watching as the precious fuel flows into storage tanks that will feed the growing appetite of German industry and military preparation. But triumph carries its own momentum. Success breeds demand for greater success. The 4-year plan's targets, ambitious when first announced, begin to seem conservative as Germany's strategic situation evolves. More plants must be built. Existing facilities must expand further. Production quotas climb relentlessly upward. Other synthetic fuel complexes rise across Germany. Perlitz in Pomerania, Scholven in the Ruhr, Berlin in Saxony. Each follows the Leuna model, massive industrial installations that transform coal into liquid fuel through the application of extreme chemistry and German engineering excellence. The landscape of industrial Germany transforms as these chemical cities emerge from agricultural countryside. The technical achievements are undeniable. German chemists and engineers have solved problems that stymied researchers worldwide. They have created an industry from theoretical knowledge, built production facilities of unprecedented complexity, and achieved fuel output that begins to approach the targets set by the 4-year plan. Yet success brings its own moral compromises. The pressure to meet production targets, the shortage of willing workers, the Reich's expanding appetite for synthetic fuel. These forces combine to create situations that the original researchers like Bergius could never have anticipated. Decisions made in boardrooms and planning offices begin to filter down to the factory floor in ways that transform the character of synthetic fuel production. Ambros finds himself caught between technical excellence and practical necessity. His chemical processes work beautifully. The yields improve monthly, the quality meets or exceeds specifications, and the cost per liter continues to decline. But the human infrastructure required to sustain this technical success grows increasingly complex and morally ambiguous. Late at night, walking through the Leuna complex, Ambros can hear the sounds of continuous production. The hum of pumps, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic clang of machinery that never stops. The synthetic fuel industry has become a creature that must be fed constantly. Coal, water, electricity, and human labor in quantities that strain Germany's resources. The coal dust settles on everything: buildings, equipment, workers' clothing, the surrounding countryside. It is the physical manifestation of Germany's determination to achieve petroleum independence through the transformation of its most abundant natural resource. But dust carries more than carbon particles. It carries the accumulated weight of compromises made and moral boundaries crossed in pursuit of strategic objectives. As 1938 dawns, the synthetic fuel program stands as both triumph and warning. German chemistry has achieved what many thought impossible. Industrial engineering has created production facilities of stunning complexity and effectiveness. The Reich moves steadily toward its goal of petroleum independence. But the human cost, the moral price of this technical achievement, continues to accumulate like coal dust in the corners of factory buildings. Ambros and his fellow chemists, focused on their technical challenges, have yet to fully comprehend where their success is leading. The machinery of synthetic fuel production operates with increasing efficiency, but it has developed an appetite for resources that conventional labor practices cannot satisfy. The stage is set for compromises that will transform the character of synthetic fuel production from industrial achievement to something far darker, something that will haunt the consciences of those involved for decades to come. In the quiet between one production run and the next, as the reaction vessels cool and the pumps cycle down for maintenance, we pause to consider how technical brilliance and moral blindness can coexist within the same industrial system. The coal has been transformed into fuel, but what transformations await the human beings caught within this expanding web of chemical ambition? And/or the price of progress? The answer to that question begins to emerge in the winter of 1940, when the snow falls heavy across the occupied territories of Poland. The synthetic fuel program, so carefully engineered, so precisely calculated, faces a crisis that no amount of technical brilliance can solve alone. Labor. Human hands, human backs, human lives. The expansion of synthetic fuel production requires workers, tens of thousands of them, to dig foundations, to pour concrete, to weld pipes, to operate the increasingly complex machinery that transforms coal into the lifeblood of the German war machine. But Germany's own workforce, already stretched thin by military mobilization, cannot meet these demands. Otto Ambros stands before a map in his office at IG Farben headquarters, his finger tracing the locations of planned synthetic fuel facilities. Monowitz, a small Polish town near the confluence of the Vistula and Sola rivers. The geography is perfect. Coal deposits nearby, transportation links established, water supply adequate for industrial needs. What makes Monowitz particularly attractive to Ambros and his colleagues is its proximity to something else entirely. 3 kilometers away, construction has begun on a complex that will become synonymous with humanity's darkest chapter, Auschwitz. The decision, when it comes, is presented in the language of industrial efficiency. Reichsfuhrer Himmler himself approves the arrangement. The SS will provide workers, prisoners, for the construction and operation of what will become known as Auschwitz III, or Bühne Monowitz, named after the synthetic rubber that will be produced alongside synthetic fuel. IG Farben will pay the SS 4 Reichsmarks per day for each skilled worker, 3 Reichsmarks for unskilled labor. The prisoners themselves will receive nothing. In the spring of 1941, the first transport trains arrive at the construction site. The men who step down from the cattle cars, blinking in the harsh Polish sunlight, are political prisoners, resistance fighters, intellectuals, Jews from across occupied Europe. They carry nothing but the clothes on their backs, and perhaps, somewhere deep within, the fading memory of lives that once held meaning beyond mere survival. The barracks rise quickly from the muddy ground. Wooden structures, hastily constructed, designed not for comfort but for the most basic containment of human bodies during the brief hours when those bodies are not required for labor. The prisoners sleep on wooden boards 3 tiers high, with barely enough space for a man to lie flat. The work begins before dawn, roll call in the darkness, as guards with flashlights and dogs count and recount the living, noting the absence of those who will not answer to their numbers again. Then, the march to the construction site, where the great synthetic fuel complex begins to take shape through the application of human suffering measured in precise industrial units. The foundations alone require the movement of thousands of tons of earth and stone. Prisoners dig with inadequate tools, their hands raw and bleeding, their bodies weakening on rations calculated to provide just enough nutrition to sustain labor, but not enough to sustain hope. Among them, we might imagine, is a chemistry professor from Prague, who once lectured on the very processes now being implemented around him, a man who understood the elegant dance of molecules, the transformation of carbon chains, the beauty of chemical synthesis. Now he carries buckets of concrete, his academic knowledge rendered meaningless by the brutal arithmetic of forced labor. Or perhaps a young engineer from Warsaw who had dreamed of building bridges, of creating structures that would stand for centuries as monuments to human achievement. Now he helps construct a facility designed to fuel a war machine, built on the systematic destruction of everything he once held sacred. The irony, bitter and inescapable, is that many of these prisoners possess exactly the technical expertise that IG Farben desperately needs. But the logic of the camp, the dehumanizing ideology that brought them here, prevents their knowledge from being recognized, let alone utilized. As the months pass, the synthetic fuel plant begins to take recognizable form. The great reaction vessels rise like metal cathedrals, their surfaces reflecting the grey Polish sky. The maze of pipes and conduits spreads across the landscape, a circulatory system designed to carry the chemical lifeblood of industrial transformation. But the human cost accumulates with mathematical precision. The prisoners work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in conditions that would challenge healthy, well-fed workers. Malnutrition becomes endemic. Disease spreads through the overcrowded barracks. Industrial accidents, inevitable in such circumstances, are treated not as tragedies but as minor disruptions to production schedules. The guards, many of them ordinary men from ordinary German towns, adapt to their role as overseers of systematic brutality, some with evident satisfaction, others with the grim resignation of men following orders in a world where questioning those orders has become unthinkable. The prisoners develop their own survival strategies, their own underground economy of favors and protection. A piece of bread becomes currency. A warm jacket, salvation, the ability to secure assignment to indoor work, the difference between life and death as winter approaches. Among the technical staff, the engineers and chemists who supervise the construction, reactions vary. Some maintain a studied ignorance, focusing entirely on their technical responsibilities, treating the prisoners as merely another industrial input, like coal or limestone. Others, privately troubled, find ways to provide small mercies, a slightly larger food ration, assignment to less dangerous work, tiny acts of humanity that might save a life or simply delay the inevitable. Otto Ambros himself makes regular inspection tours, walking through the construction site in his well-tailored coat, discussing technical specifications with his subordinates while prisoners labor in the background, their presence so normalized that they become almost invisible. Human machinery operating at the periphery of vision. By the winter of 1942, the first production units come online. The great dream of synthetic fuel, conceived in the laboratories of brilliant chemists, nurtured through decades of research and development, finally achieves its full industrial expression. Coal enters the process as raw material, emerges as liquid fuel, ready to power the tanks and aircraft of the German military. The chemical transformation is flawless, the engineering, elegant in its efficiency, the production numbers, impressive by any industrial standard, but the human transformation, the change wrought in both prisoners and guards, in engineers and administrators, represents a different kind of chemistry entirely. The systematic dehumanization required to make such a system function changes everyone it touches. The prisoners, those who survive, learn to navigate a world where their value is measured entirely in units of labor extracted. They develop the psychological mechanisms necessary to endure systematic brutality, to maintain some core of identity in circumstances designed to erase individuality entirely. The guards and administrators, meanwhile, must reconcile their participation in systematic cruelty with whatever moral framework they brought to their roles. Some embrace the ideology that justifies their actions. Others compartmentalize, separating their work lives from their private consciences. Still others, quietly, begin to question not just the methods but the entire enterprise they serve. As 1943 dawns, the Buna Monowitz facility represents both the triumph and the damnation of German synthetic fuel technology. The technical achievement is undeniable, a fully integrated chemical complex capable of producing thousands of tons of synthetic fuel and rubber. The human cost, equally undeniable, measured not just in lives lost, but in the moral corruption of everyone involved in its creation and operation. The prisoners continue their labor, their numbers replenished by regular transports as disease and exhaustion take their toll. The production lines continue their operation, transforming coal into fuel with mechanical precision. And somewhere in the space between these two realities, in the gap between technical brilliance and moral blindness, the true price of progress reveals itself. For the synthetic fuel program, born from legitimate scientific curiosity and national necessity, has become something else entirely. A demonstration of how human knowledge, divorced from human compassion, can serve the darkest purposes imaginable. The coal continues its transformation, carbon chains rearranging themselves according to the immutable laws of chemistry. But the humans caught within this system undergo their own transformations, changes that no amount of technical expertise can reverse, alterations to the human spirit that will echo through generations. In the quiet moments between shifts, when the machinery pauses and the guards change, we might hear something that no engineer planned for, no chemist anticipated. The sound of human resilience, fragile but persistent, surviving even in conditions designed to destroy it entirely. The whispered prayers, the shared scraps of food, the small acts of solidarity that prove, even here, that something essentially human endures. But we might also hear something else, the silence of moral compromise, the quiet acceptance of the unacceptable, the gradual erosion of conscience under the steady pressure of normalized atrocity. Both sounds, intertwined, form the true soundtrack of synthetic fuel production in the depths of World War II, a symphony of human complexity, playing out against the backdrop of industrial achievement, reminding us that every technical triumph carries within it the potential for both creation and destruction, both progress and damnation. The choice, as always, lies not in the technology itself, but in the hands and hearts of those who wield it. Peak production and the chemical war. By 1944, the machinery of synthetic fuel production had reached its terrible zenith. The sprawling industrial complexes that dotted the German landscape hummed with unprecedented activity, their towering distillation columns and crackling reactors working around the clock to transform coal into the lifeblood of a dying empire. At Leuna, at Perlitz, at the dozen other facilities scattered across occupied Europe, the Fischer-Tropsch process had evolved into something approaching industrial poetry. Carbon monoxide and hydrogen danced together at precisely controlled temperatures, guided by cobalt and iron catalysts that Otto Ambros and his team had refined through years of meticulous experimentation. The chemistry itself remained elegant, almost beautiful in its simplicity, yet the scale had grown monstrous. Each day, these facilities consumed roughly 40,000 tons of coal, transforming it through a cascade of chemical reactions into aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, and the countless petroleum derivatives that modern warfare demanded. The numbers tell their own story, a story of desperation disguised as triumph. The process began in the gasification chambers, where coal met superheated steam at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. Here, in furnaces that glowed like captured stars, solid carbon transformed into synthesis gas, that crucial mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen that would become the foundation of everything that followed. German engineers had perfected the art of controlling this transformation, adjusting pressure and temperature with precision that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. They understood, perhaps better than anyone in the world, how to coax maximum yield from their precious coal reserves, how to extract every possible molecule of synthetic petroleum from the black rock that lay beneath their feet. From the gasification chambers, the synthesis gas flowed through miles of carefully engineered piping, its temperature and pressure monitored at every stage, its composition adjusted with the addition of carefully calculated quantities of steam and recycled gases. The German chemical engineers had become masters of this molecular choreography, conducting symphonies of atoms and molecules with the skill of virtuoso musicians. In the synthesis reactors themselves, the true magic occurred. Here, under pressures reaching 25 atmospheres and temperatures hovering around 200 degrees Celsius, carbon monoxide and hydrogen combined in the presence of those precious catalysts, slowly building the long-chain hydrocarbons that would become gasoline, diesel, and lubricating oils. The Fischer-Tropsch process had always been temperamental, requiring constant attention and adjustment. But by 1944, the German operators had learned to read its moods like experienced shepherds reading the weather. They knew when to adjust the catalyst bed temperature, when to modify the gas flow rates, when to shut down a reactor for regeneration of its precious cobalt catalysts. Each facility had developed its own subtle variations, its own optimizations born from years of trial and error. The engineers at Leuna had perfected techniques for producing high-octane aviation gasoline, while their colleagues at Perlitz had specialized in the diesel fuels that powered U-boats and tank divisions. This distributed expertise had become both a strength and a vulnerability, creating a network of knowledge that was simultaneously robust and fragile. The scale of production in 1944 was staggering, almost incomprehensible. Germany's synthetic fuel facilities were producing over 4 million tons of petroleum products annually, roughly two-thirds of the country's total liquid fuel consumption. Without these facilities, the Luftwaffe would have been grounded, the Wehrmacht immobilized, the entire German war machine reduced to scrap metal within months. This dependence had created a curious paradox. The very success of the synthetic fuel program had made Germany simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable than ever before. Every Messerschmitt that climbed toward Allied bomber formations, every panzer that rolled across the Eastern Front, every U-boat that prowled the Atlantic shipping lanes, depended entirely on the continued operation of these massive chemical complexes. The Luftwaffe's relationship with synthetic fuel had become particularly intimate and particularly desperate. High-performance aircraft engines demanded high-octane aviation gasoline, fuel that could withstand the extreme pressures and temperatures of supercharged engines without detonating prematurely. Natural petroleum could provide such fuel, but Germany had precious little natural petroleum, so synthetic fuel had to suffice. German chemists had pushed their processes to the absolute limits, developing techniques for producing aviation gasoline with octane ratings approaching 100. This required additional processing steps, additional equipment, additional complexity that made the entire system more vulnerable to disruption. Yet there was no choice. Modern air warfare demanded high-performance fuel, and synthetic processes were the only way to obtain it. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful engineers. They were using the most advanced chemical technology in the world to produce fuel for aircraft that would likely be shot down within weeks or days of entering combat. The Luftwaffe's pilot training program had been decimated by losses, its experienced aviators replaced by teenagers with minimal flight time. Yet the synthetic fuel facilities continued their relentless production, feeding an increasingly desperate war machine. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence had begun to grasp the true significance of Germany's synthetic fuel dependence. Reconnaissance flights revealed the massive scale of facilities like Leuna and Perlitz, their sprawling networks of pipes and towers and storage tanks covering areas larger than entire cities. Photographic analysts studied these images with growing understanding, recognizing that they were looking at the industrial heart of the German war effort. The vulnerability was obvious, yet so was the difficulty of exploiting it. These facilities were heavily defended, surrounded by flak towers and fighter airfields, protected by some of the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses in Europe. Moreover, they were built to industrial standards that could withstand significant damage. Their critical components distributed and redundant, their operations designed to continue even under attack. German engineers had learned hard lessons from earlier bombing campaigns. They had dispersed critical equipment, created backup systems, developed rapid repair procedures that could restore production within days of an attack. The synthetic fuel facilities had become fortresses of industrial resilience, protected not just by guns and aircraft, but by clever engineering and careful planning. Yet the fundamental chemistry remained unchanged, and chemistry, for all its elegance, imposed its own constraints. The Fischer-Tropsch process required precise conditions, stable temperatures and pressures, uninterrupted flows of raw materials and utilities. A single broken pipe, a damaged catalyst bed, a disrupted power supply could shut down entire production trains for weeks. The workers who operated these facilities understood this vulnerability intimately. German technicians, foreign laborers, concentration camp prisoners, all worked within sight of the same towering reactors. All understood that their lives depended on keeping the process running smoothly. The chemistry created its own form of discipline, more absolute than any guard or overseer, because the consequences of failure were written into the molecular structure of the process itself. In the control rooms of these facilities, German engineers monitored banks of gauges and charts that tracked every aspect of the production process: temperature readings, pressure measurements, flow rates, catalyst activity, all recorded with meticulous precision, all analyzed for signs of trouble or opportunity for optimization. These men had become priests of a technological religion, devoted to maintaining the delicate balance that kept synthesis gas flowing and hydrocarbons forming. The night shifts were particularly intense, when skeleton crews maintained operations that could not be allowed to stop, when the responsibility for millions of tons of annual production rested on the shoulders of a few dozen technicians. They moved through the facilities like ghosts, checking readings, adjusting valves, listening to the subtle sounds that indicated whether the process was running smoothly or developing problems. The smell of synthetic fuel production was distinctive, a complex mixture of coal tar, hydrogen sulfide, and the sweet scent of freshly synthesized hydrocarbons. Workers learned to read these smells like a language, detecting problems before instruments could register them, sensing changes in the process through their noses rather than their eyes. By late 1944, this entire elaborate system had reached its peak of efficiency and its maximum vulnerability. Every reactor was running at capacity. Every optimization had been implemented. Every possible improvement had been wrung from the basic Fischer-Tropsch chemistry. The German synthetic fuel program had achieved everything its designers had dreamed, yet it remained as fragile as spun glass, dependent on continued access to coal, continued operation of complex equipment, continued availability of skilled workers, continued protection from Allied bombing. The engineers who had built this system understood its precarious nature. They had created something magnificent and terrible, a technological achievement that rivaled any in human history, yet one that existed entirely in service of destruction, entirely dependent on the continuation of a war that was already lost. In the gathering darkness of 1944, as autumn gave way to winter, the synthetic fuel facilities continued their relentless production, their towers reaching towards stars that seemed increasingly distant, their furnaces burning with fires that illuminated a landscape growing ever more desolate, their chemistry proceeding with mechanical precision, transforming coal into fuel, fuel into motion, motion into the final spasms of a dying empire. The peak had been reached. Now, only the descent remained. And bombs fall on Leuna. The descent began not with a single moment, but with the distant drone of engines, growing louder each day, until the sky itself seemed to vibrate with approaching thunder. By late 1944, Allied intelligence had finally grasped what German engineers had known for years, that synthetic fuel was not merely important to the German war machine, it was the war machine. Without these plants, without their steady transformation of coal into gasoline and diesel, the Luftwaffe would be grounded, the panzer divisions immobilized, the U-boats tethered to their ports like sleeping giants. The targeting had been methodical, almost surgical in its precision. Colonel Malcolm Moss, chief of the oil division in Allied intelligence, had spent months poring over reconnaissance photographs, studying the geometric patterns of cooling towers and distillation columns, learning to read the industrial landscape like a vast chemical equation. Each plant had its vulnerabilities, each process its critical choke points. Strike the hydrogenation units first, he had written in his classified memoranda, then the power stations, then the oxygen plants. The chemistry itself became the weapon, understanding that synthetic fuel production was not a single process, but a delicate symphony of interconnected reactions, each dependent on the others, each representing a potential point of catastrophic failure. The first major raid on Leuna came on a crystalline morning in May, when visibility stretched for miles and the target coordinates aligned perfectly with the bombardier's calculations. 350 B-17 flying fortresses approached from the southwest, their formations so precise they cast geometric shadows across the German countryside, like deadly constellations moving across the earth. Inside the lead aircraft, Technical Sergeant Robert Chen checked his instruments one final time, his breath visible in the thin air at 25,000 feet. Below, the Leuna complex spread across the landscape like a miniature city, its towers and smokestacks creating a distinctive skyline that matched exactly the recognition photographs he had memorized. The synthetic fuel plant that had taken decades to build, that represented the pinnacle of German chemical engineering, that employed thousands of workers and prisoners, lay exposed beneath the clear morning sky. "Bomb bay doors open," came the call through the intercom, and Chen felt the aircraft shudder slightly as the belly opened to reveal the ordnance within. 500-pound high-explosive bombs, each one precisely calculated to deliver maximum damage to the reinforced concrete and steel below. The mathematics of destruction had become as sophisticated as the chemistry of creation. On the ground, Otto Kleist pressed himself against the concrete wall of the control room as the air raid sirens wailed their familiar warning. As shift supervisor for the primary hydrogenation unit, he had witnessed dozens of these alerts over the past months, most of them false alarms or raids targeting other facilities. But something felt different this morning. The sound of the engines was too coordinated, too purposeful. Through the reinforced windows, he could see workers and prisoners alike running for the designated shelters, their movements creating streams of humanity flowing between the massive industrial structures. The forced laborers moved with particular urgency, knowing that their lives were considered expendable, that the concrete shelters might not accommodate everyone, that survival often depended on reaching safety first. The first bombs fell at exactly 10:47 a.m., their whistling descent creating a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air. Kleist felt the explosions through the soles of his feet before he heard them, the shock waves traveling through the earth and concrete faster than sound through air. The carefully calibrated pressures and temperatures of the synthetic fuel process, maintained with such precision for so many months, began to fluctuate wildly as power systems failed and control mechanisms shattered. In the hydrogenation chambers, where coal and hydrogen had danced their molecular ballet under extreme pressure, the delicate equilibrium collapsed in seconds. Pipes ruptured, releasing superheated steam and toxic gases, while electrical systems sparked and failed throughout the complex. The chemistry that had seemed so controlled, so predictable, revealed its chaotic potential when the industrial framework that contained it began to crumble. Chen watched the explosions bloom below like deadly flowers, each burst of flame and smoke marking another wound in the synthetic fuel infrastructure. The precision bombing techniques developed over months of training were proving devastatingly effective, the carefully calculated impact patterns creating cascading failures throughout the interconnected systems. What had taken years to build was unraveling in minutes. But even as the bombs fell, even as the immediate destruction mounted, the true impact lay not in the spectacular explosions, but in the invisible damage to the chemical processes themselves. Catalyst beds that had taken weeks to properly prepare were contaminated with debris. Distillation columns were knocked out of alignment. The precise temperature and pressure controls that synthetic fuel production demanded were shattered beyond immediate repair. The raid lasted 18 minutes, but its effects would resonate for months. As the last of the B-17s disappeared into the eastern sky, Kleist emerged from the control room to survey the devastation. The main hydrogenation unit, the heart of the Leuna facility, was a twisted mass of steel and concrete. Fires burned throughout the complex, fed by the very fuels the plant had been designed to produce, creating an ironic funeral pyre for German synthetic fuel ambitions. The human cost was immediate and terrible. 43 workers and prisoners had been killed in the raid, their bodies scattered among the industrial wreckage like broken dolls. Many more were injured, some by flying debris, others by exposure to the toxic chemicals released when containment systems failed. The forced laborers, as always, bore a disproportionate share of the casualties, their lives measured in production quotas rather than human worth. But the strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate destruction at Leuna. Within days, similar raids struck the other major synthetic fuel facilities across Germany: Perlitz, Zeitz, Berlin, Merseburg, each plant targeted with the same methodical precision, each attack designed to create maximum disruption to the chemical processes that had sustained German military operations for so long. The repair efforts began almost immediately, but they revealed the fundamental vulnerability that had always lurked beneath the surface of the synthetic fuel program: the specialized equipment, the precise catalysts, the technical expertise required. None of these could be quickly replaced. German engineers found themselves attempting to rebuild not just damaged infrastructure, but an entire technological ecosystem that had taken decades to develop. Dr. Friedrich Bergius, now an elderly man whose youthful dreams of energy independence seemed like echoes from another world, received reports of the bombing damage with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. The science he had pioneered, the chemistry he had perfected, had become both weapon and target in a conflict that had consumed everything it touched. The coal liquefaction process that was supposed to free Germany from dependence on foreign oil had instead made the nation dependent on increasingly scarce resources, increasingly desperate measures, increasingly terrible compromises. The autumn of 1944 brought wave after wave of bombing raids, each one more devastating than the last. The Allied air forces had found their rhythm, their targeting becoming more sophisticated, their understanding of synthetic fuel vulnerabilities more complete. What had begun as experimental raids evolved into systematic destruction, a methodical dismantling of the chemical infrastructure that had powered German resistance. By November, production at most synthetic fuel facilities had dropped to less than 30% of capacity. The carefully maintained production schedules, the precise quotas that had driven the system for so long, became meaningless numbers on increasingly irrelevant reports. The mathematics of synthetic fuel production, once a source of German pride, had been overwhelmed by the mathematics of destruction. In the bombed-out control rooms and shattered laboratories, among the twisted pipes and collapsed cooling towers, the dreams of energy independence lay buried beneath rubble and ash. The synthetic fuel program that had promised to sustain the German war machine indefinitely had become instead a monument to the limits of industrial ambition, a testament to the fragility of even the most sophisticated technological systems when subjected to sustained assault. The workers and prisoners who had survived the bombing campaigns found themselves increasingly engaged in salvage operations rather than production, picking through the wreckage for anything that might be repaired or repurposed, attempting to maintain some semblance of industrial activity amid the growing chaos. But the complex chemistry that had once transformed coal into liquid fuel required more than salvaged equipment. It demanded the kind of systematic precision that was no longer possible in a world of constant air raids and dwindling resources. As winter approached, as the days grew shorter and the bombing raids continued their relentless rhythm, the synthetic fuel facilities that had once hummed with productive energy fell increasingly silent. The great towers that had reached toward the sky like monuments to human ingenuity stood broken and empty. Their chambers cold, their furnaces extinguished, their chemistry reduced to memory and ash. The peak of German synthetic fuel production, that moment of technological triumph in early 1944, now seemed like a distant dream. A brief flowering of industrial capability that had been crushed beneath the weight of strategic bombing and the inexorable logic of total war. The descent that had begun with the distant drone of engines had accelerated into a collapse that would reshape not only the German war effort, but the entire trajectory of chemical engineering in the post-war world. Echoes of a chemical war, the factories fell silent one by one, their towering distillation columns growing cold in the winter of 1944. While across the Atlantic, teams of American chemical engineers were already studying captured German patents, already planning how this revolutionary technology might be transformed, stripped of its associations with forced labor and human suffering, and rebuilt in the service of peacetime industry. In the laboratories of Standard Oil and DuPont, in the research halls of universities from MIT to Berkeley, The fundamental chemistry that Friedrich Bergius had pioneered 3 decades earlier was being dissected, analyzed, reimagined for a world that would soon discover vast new reserves of petroleum beneath Middle Eastern sands, making synthetic fuel economically obsolete even as its technical mysteries were finally being unlocked by Allied scientists who had spent years wondering how Germany had sustained its war machine for so long. Otto Ambros, the brilliant chemist who had overseen the expansion of synthetic fuel production, who had walked through the construction sites of Auschwitz-Monowitz and signed the contracts for prisoner labor, found himself in an American detention center in 1945, his notebooks confiscated, his formulas studied by the very engineers whose bombers had destroyed his life's work. He would speak quietly to his interrogators about catalysts and reaction temperatures, about the delicate balance of pressure and heat required to transform coal into gasoline. But he would say little about the prisoners who had built his factories, the forced laborers who had maintained his equipment, the human cost of his chemical achievements. The Nuremberg trials would eventually sentence him to 8 years imprisonment for his role in the use of slave labor. But the chemistry itself, the fundamental knowledge of how carbon atoms could be rearranged and recombined, that knowledge had already escaped into the broader world of science, carrying with it both the promise of future innovation and the permanent stain of its wartime applications. Friedrich Bergius himself, the Nobel laureate who had started it all with his early experiments in coal liquefaction, lived to see his invention both triumph and fail, both revolutionize industrial chemistry and become forever associated with some of the darkest chapters of human history. In his later years, living quietly in Buenos Aires, he would sometimes speak to visiting scientists about the pure joy of discovery, about those early moments in his laboratory when he first realized that coal could be transformed into liquid fuel. But his eyes would grow distant when asked about what his discovery had enabled, what it had cost, what it had ultimately meant for the world. The physical remnants of the synthetic fuel program scattered across the German landscape like archaeological fragments of an industrial civilization that had pushed too far, too fast, in pursuit of chemical independence. At Leuna, the massive cracking towers stood twisted and blackened, their steel frameworks resembling the skeletons of prehistoric creatures, while weeds began to grow through the concrete foundations where prisoners had once labored under the harsh lights of forced construction schedules. The environmental legacy would prove even more persistent than the physical ruins, for decades of intensive chemical production had left the soil around these facilities saturated with benzene and toluene, with the toxic byproducts of hydrogenation reactions that had never been properly contained or disposed of. The groundwater beneath Auschwitz-Monowitz, beneath Leuna, beneath all the major synthetic fuel installations, would remain contaminated for generations, a chemical signature of industrial ambition that had prioritized production over environmental protection, efficiency over human welfare. Local residents, the German civilians who had lived in the shadows of these facilities, who had watched the prisoner transports arrive and the smokestacks belch their endless streams of chemical vapors, found themselves reluctant witnesses to a history they preferred not to discuss. In the villages surrounding Leuna, in the towns near the satellite camps of Auschwitz, people would speak carefully about the war years, about the jobs the chemical plants had provided, about the air raids they had endured, but they would fall silent when asked about the foreign workers, the prisoners, the people who had simply disappeared when the facilities were abandoned. The technical documentation, the thousands of pages of process specifications and chemical formulas that had been captured by Allied forces, made its way into corporate archives and university libraries, where it would influence the development of petrochemical industries for decades to come. The knowledge of how to synthesize complex organic compounds, how to manage large-scale catalytic processes, how to integrate multiple chemical production streams into efficient industrial complexes. This knowledge would help build the post-war chemical industry that produced plastics and pharmaceuticals, synthetic fibers and agricultural chemicals, contributing to innovations that would improve millions of lives, even as its origins remained buried in classified reports and forgotten histories. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Germany's synthetic fuel program was not technological or environmental, but moral. a permanent reminder of how easily scientific progress could be divorced from ethical consideration, how technical achievement could be pursued without regard for human cost, how the excitement of solving complex engineering problems could blind brilliant minds to the suffering their solutions enabled. The prisoners who had survived the construction and operation of these facilities, those who lived to see liberation, carried with them not only the physical scars of forced labor, but also a unique understanding of how industrial systems could be designed to exploit human beings as efficiently as they processed raw materials. Their testimonies, recorded years later by historians and war crimes investigators, revealed the systematic dehumanization that had made such massive construction projects possible. The careful calculations that had determined how little food was needed to sustain a worker, how many hours of labor could be extracted before collapse, how human beings could be integrated into industrial processes as disposable components. These accounts would eventually find their way into archives and museums, into academic studies and documentary films, but for decades they remained largely unexamined, part of a broader reluctance to confront the full implications of what had been accomplished through forced labor, what technical achievements had cost in human terms, what moral compromises had enabled such rapid industrial expansion. The chemical engineers who studied the captured German documentation in the post-war years, who marveled at the sophistication of the synthetic fuel processes, who incorporated these innovations into their own industrial designs, rarely considered the conditions under which this knowledge had been developed, the human suffering that had enabled such extensive experimentation, the ethical questions that should have accompanied their technical admiration. In the end, as the decades passed and the ruins of the synthetic fuel facilities gradually disappeared beneath new construction or returned to forest, what remained was a complex legacy of innovation and atrocity, of scientific achievement built upon moral failure, of technical knowledge that could never be separated from the circumstances of its creation. The coal that had once fed these massive installations returned to the earth. The hydrogen that had been so carefully managed in countless reactions dispersed into the atmosphere. The carbon chains that had been so precisely assembled and reassembled broke down into simpler compounds, returning to the natural cycles that had been temporarily interrupted by human ambition and chemical engineering. And in the quiet spaces where these facilities had once operated, where the constant hum of machinery had been replaced by the gentler sounds of wind through grass and the distant calls of birds, where the harsh artificial lighting had given way to the softer rhythms of sunrise and sunset, there remained only the faintest traces of what had been accomplished and what it had cost, the chemical signatures slowly fading into the broader story of carbon and hydrogen, of human ambition and human suffering, of scientific progress and moral reckoning, echoing quietly through the decades like distant memories of a time when the transformation of coal into fuel had seemed like the most important problem in the world, when the solution to energy independence had justified any sacrifice, when the chemistry of carbon had become entangled with the deepest questions of human nature and industrial civilization, leaving behind only these quiet ruins and the enduring reminder that technical achievement without moral consideration creates legacies that persist long after the machinery falls silent and the smokestacks crumble and the last traces of synthetic fuel evaporate into the evening air.